Thanks for joining us today. We're in First Thessalonians chapter 2 under the idea of character. We're studying this book of First Thessalonians about living and thriving spiritually and longing for the Lord all at the same time. And we've been through an introductory discussion of the book of Thessalonians. We have last Wednesday went through First Thessalonians chapter 1, where the emphasis was upon conversion. And now we turn our attention today to First Thessalonians chapter 2, where the emphasis is upon the character of the Apostle Paul and Silas and Timothy, his companions in ministry and in the establishment of the Thessalonian church. Now, this particular chapter is about 20 verses long, and we're only going to cover about the first 12 verses in this particular session. And so if you have your Bible, I hope that you'll begin reading with me in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. He says, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." Now, in these first 12 verses, the Apostle Paul this chapter is really a commentary on two statements made in the first chapter as we know it. And in verse 5, he says, "Because our gospel came to you not only in word, but also in power and the Holy Spirit with conviction. You know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake." And it's that statement at the end of verse 5 that the first 12 verses of 1 Thessalonians 2 really focus on. Paul says, "Let me talk to you about my character. How did I behave among you?" Now, there are two different schools of thought as to why he's doing this. The first is that, like some other places, especially the church at Corinth, his apostleship was being attacked, or at least his ministry style was being attacked. But there doesn't seem to be any hint of that really in the Thessalonian letters, not the way that was in Corinth or Galatia or something like that. And so it seems that he's just setting forth a model of ethics that he wants the Thessalonians to follow. And so he's going to expound upon this. And this particular section of verses, these 12 verses, really illustrate a statement made by the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 28, when he described all of the physical ailments that he had suffered and persecutions he had suffered for the gospel. He says, "Besides all these things, the things which fall upon me daily, my care or my anxieties for all the churches." Paul had an intimate concern for every congregation in which he was involved, especially with starting and planting and even interacting with. And anyone who's ever been in ministry knows that no matter how long ago it was that you may have served in that particular congregation, you will always have a vested interest in the development of congregations. And so this is one of those moments where we see that interest. Also, when we look at these 12 verses, we learn something about the ministerial heart of Paul. There are two other books that really show his heart in ministry. Obviously, 2 Timothy being one, it's extremely emotion-packed. But 2 Corinthians really is a book. We often talk about the letters of Timothy and Titus when we talk about preaching letters. But the book of 2 Corinthians is really an examination of the heart of the Apostle Paul. You see just how open his heart is and just how wonderful his heart for ministry is. And these 12 verses are kind of a condensed version of 2 Corinthians as he is revealing his ministerial heart. And so keep that in mind as we walk through these passages. These verses have really kept me up at night the last couple of nights, just thinking through everything that's being said and then walking through them. And hopefully in some way we can identify with the heart of the apostle. Now, this chapter breaks into three different sections. We're only going to cover the first section, verses 1 through 12. And the word that we'll assign to this section is the word purity. Purity. Now, in the first 8 verses, he will follow this cycle where he will address things in a negative way and then a positive way. So we're going to call this section negatively. Verses 1 through 8, negatively. Because he's going to talk about the negative first, and then he will answer it with some positives. Now, when you come to verses 9 through 12, he does not address the negative as much. He focuses more upon the positive, what he did while he was among them. And so, as we look at the first 8 verses and we see negatively where he starts this process of we didn't do this, but we did this, there are 3 ideas that really come to the forefront. In verses 1 and 2, he talks to us about perseverance. In verses 3 and 4, he describes his presence among them. When he was there, how did he conduct himself? And then in verses 5 through 8, he discusses his practice. When he was amongst them, this is what he did, and this is what he did not do. And so let's begin by, first of all, looking at his perseverance. Number 1, he says that his perseverance in the face of persecution was profitable. He says, you know yourselves that our coming to you was not in vain. It was not empty. It was not worthless. When we just got done with chapter 1 and we saw how well the church at Thessalonica was doing, they were thriving. And so his coming to them to preach the gospel was anything but in vain. As a matter of fact, in chapter 3, we'll see a little bit later, verses 5 and 6 in our study, that he wanted to know how they were doing, and he just couldn't take it anymore. He could not stand the thought that he had labored in vain among the Thessalonians, and then Timothy brings word that they are not only surviving, but they are thriving, and that leads him to write this letter. And so he's very concerned, but he has received word that things are well, and he says, you know that our coming to you wasn't worthless. We didn't waste our time in coming to preach the gospel to you. He says, but we were persecuted. We had suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know. You remember in Acts chapter 16 that they had been tried and beaten and jailed unjustly. And the city rulers realized they made a mistake and asked them to leave quietly and privately at the end of Acts chapter 16. And of course, this was right before they made a 3-day trip down to Thessalonica to begin that congregation. And so they had been extremely persecuted, is what he's saying, in Philippi. And what's interesting to me is when I look at this through ministry eyes, and that doesn't make these eyes any better than anyone else's. For an example, when I look at 1 Kings and I see Solomon building the temple, I will often appeal to someone who is in the construction industry. Because what they see when they read that about construction, they see things that I don't see because it's what they do every day. And so when I read this through ministry eyes, what I see is this. He had shared with them the hurts that he had experienced in another location of his work. And that is a high level of intimacy. To entrust and to open up your heart to someone and to reveal to them your past hurts. That creates or that takes a great deal of trust with the person, in the person with whom you're sharing your past ministry hurts. And so that tells you something about something that's going to be said later in this chapter in verse 8 when he says, we didn't just share the gospel with you. We were ready to share the entirety of our beings with you. And it's a wonderful message about ministry. He said, but in spite of all that, we remained persistent. We had boldness in our God to declare the gospel of God in much conflict. The words were flowing freely. We didn't hold back. We preached the gospel in the midst of all of this conflict or this struggle. This is a word that was often used to describe the Olympic Games and athletic events and the agony and the ongoing battle of competition. And so he says, and of course, the first 3 Sabbaths that he was there was that agony, that back and forth with the Jews in the synagogue, and then the assault on the house of Jason and other things along that line. They were constantly battling. He says, but I want you to understand that we were persistent. Because we were persistent, we entered in amongst you, we preached the gospel to you, and that was not in vain. And you're Christians today because we remain persistent. So let's talk then, he says, about our presence. When we were with you, what was it that was really motivating us? And this is where we get to this first round of negatives. First of all, he says, our appeal does not spring from error. We didn't come to you in ignorance. We're not preaching to you a message as many other charlatans would. You see, people don't really change. There are people preaching false messages of hope and healing and all these different things. They've always been preaching those things. And Paul said, we didn't come to you in ignorance. Our appeal didn't spring from error. We're not people who've been fooled by some supposed wise teacher. We haven't followed these cunningly devised fables and myths, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 16. That's not how we came to you. We came to you with things that we knew for certain. Then he says, when we came to you, we didn't come in immorality or impurity, filth or refuse. This word is often connected with sexual immorality or sexual impurity, although it can also be used in the sense of just impurity in a metaphorical sense. He said, we didn't behave ourselves in an immoral way amongst you. That's not the way. We didn't come to you with these thoughts of immorality motivating us to see how we could abuse you. And then he says this, we weren't insincere either. We didn't in any way attempt to deceive you. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the previous two negatives, that is, doesn't spring from error or impurity, literally the words are out of. But when you get to this word here, to deceive, the preposition that precedes it is different. It's the word in. And so he almost creates this idea that he says, we didn't operate in this sphere of deception. And the word behind this word deception is the idea of baiting a hook. We weren't here to try and trick you into something. We were here legitimately. And so he says, when we were first here, we weren't here because we were ignorant and been fooled ourselves. We weren't here for immoral purposes, and we were not here to trick you. We were not insincere in why we came to you. But then he says positively, this is what we did. We had been approved by God. But just as we had been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak. Now, the word approved is very interesting because it means something that is the result of careful examination. Now, think about that. God had entrusted these men with the gospel after a careful examination of their hearts. And then he entrusted them with the gospel and preaching the most precious message in all the world. And it's a perfect tense, which means they weren't just approved at the time he commissioned them, but they remained in that sense of approval up to the present moment. And he says, our aim then, because we had been entrusted with the gospel, God had tested us. And listen, the scrutiny of God is far more thorough and fair and just than any scrutiny of another human being. He says, we did that. Our aim was then not to please men, but to please God. Because if we pleased men, if we preached just to try and gain recognition or to gain a pat on the back, Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, we shouldn't be the servant of Christ. He says we're trying to please God who tests our hearts, and he's constantly testing our hearts. And that's one of the things that delivers you, as one writer put it, from the tyranny of human criticism. Because a lot of people will have different ideas about what your motives are. But God knows what your motives are. And there's a statement that I somewhat adapted from another writer, and he said this basically, it doesn't matter what people think of you. And it doesn't matter what you think of you. But what matters is what God knows about you. 1 Corinthians 4:3 and 4. Other people may say that your motives are insincere and impure, but that doesn't make it true. You may say your motives are sincere and pure, but that doesn't make it true. Paul said that in 1 Corinthians 4:3 and 4. It's what God knows the reality of the matter to be. And so he says, we made it our aim to please God because he's always testing our hearts. And anyone who walks around in ministry, that is a statement that we should constantly keep before our eyes, that he's constantly testing our hearts, knowing why we're doing what we're doing. And he knows, we may tell people one thing, but he knows exactly why we're doing what we're doing. And so he says, our presence among you, it wasn't out of ignorance, it wasn't out of immorality, it wasn't out of insincerity. It was about being approved by God, and that was our aim. Our only aim was to please God. Then he says, so when we were with you, here are some things we practiced. And first he begins by saying things that we didn't practice in the negative sense. He focuses on the outward. He said, for we never came with words of flattery, as you know, tailoring the truth to fit popular opinion. And I want to make a point here about this, tailoring the truth to fit popular opinion. Many times we make this point that we will tailor the truth to fit popular opinion, and we apply that to people who want to loose where God has bound. That is, we take a person who disregards the authority of God on certain subjects and we say, you see, that person, they're tailoring the truth to fit popular opinion. But you know, you can also tailor truth to fit popular opinion in the other direction as well. You can tailor truth to fit popular opinion on the right extreme as well. You can say things and preach things you have no right saying, and you have no right preaching. You have no biblical basis for preaching. And you can tailor them to fit because that's what people want you to say. But if God does not authorize it, whether it's on the left or on the right, it's rejected by God. And so flattery doesn't just take the form of telling people, oh, it doesn't matter what God said about this subject. You go do what you want to do. And it also can take the form of saying, yeah, that's right. God drew a line there when God really didn't draw a line there. But if that makes you feel better and that makes me fit into this group better, then I'll say it. Big difference. He said that was not the way. And I'm going to tell you something. When you are true to a text in ministry, when you are true to a text and not a tradition, when you are true to the truth, when you are true to God, there will be people on the right and people on the left who will be displeased with you. But God will be pleased with you because you're not tailoring the message to fit groups of people. You're simply preaching the message as God would have it be. So he says, we didn't come to you in these outward pretenses. And inwardly, it wasn't some kind of a pretext for greed. The word here is a mask. We didn't have this mask on thinking this is a way for us to make money. And listen, I understand the way the statement is made that, you know, there's no money in preaching. Well, I'm not really going to get into all the semantics and all the way to divide that out. But the truth of the matter is that there can be a lot of money in preaching. I think there are plenty of examples we can show where people have made a lot of money in preaching, not necessarily in preaching the gospel, but in preaching in general. Yes, you can make a lot of money if you're willing to tailor fit it. And so Paul says, I'm not in this for money. And, you know, I've been at this for about 13 years now. I'm not a rookie. I'm not a veteran, but I'm not a rookie either. And I know a lot of people in ministry, and I don't know of any of them that are in it because they're trying to make money. He said, that's not the reason. Now, there are certainly people that do it. And you can make a lot if you're willing to make some compromises. He said, that's not why we did it. And we didn't seek glory from other people. We weren't looking to have somebody stroke our ego. We weren't looking to have somebody pat us on the shoulder and say, you're so smart, you're so talented. That's not why we did it. That's not why we did it. He said, even though we could have made demands as the apostles of Christ, this here talking about financial support. The Bible is very clear and has spoken on this issue. Those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. There is nothing immoral about a person receiving compensation for preaching the gospel. Paul forfeited that privilege, but he always makes it clear when he does that to say, but I have that right. And when it came to the Corinthian church, he would say, I made a mistake. I should have charged you for my preaching, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 or chapter 13. And so he said, we didn't operate this way. This is how we operated, positively, verses 7 and 8. We were gentle among you. We sustained you like a nursing mother who gives life to her child. We were gentle with you. We cared for you. We imparted life to you. And that's so important because in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 to 26, when Paul is describing the servant of the Lord, one of the things that he begins by saying is the servant of the Lord must not strive. He can't be a fighter in the sense that he's looking for quarrels, but he must be gentle because the souls of people hang in the balance, and you have to be cautious and understand there are eternal consequences to how you handle these situations. And so he says, we sustained you. And then he says this, and we shared with you. He said, being so affectionately desirous of you. And this word affection carries with it the idea of the special bond between parents and children. He says, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, to preach the gospel to you, but also our own selves. There is a school of thought in ministry that says you should remain detached. You should keep people at a distance. And even that say you shouldn't have close friends in ministry in the sense of in the congregation itself. You shouldn't be closer to some people than others. The only problem with that thinking is that it's nowhere found in Scripture. What the apostle says here is, we were willing to open up ourselves and share our lives with you. Now, he didn't understand anything about keeping people at arm's distance. He opened himself up. Now, here's the truth of the matter. And it comes in general when you choose to love, period. This is the risk you're taking. When you open yourself up to people and you share yourself with someone, you're always running the possibility that you can be rejected and that those people can take what they know about you and they can hurt you deeply. And the level of the pain in which they can inflict upon you will be mind-numbing. There's no easy way to say that. But the joy that you feel from sharing your life with people, there's nothing in the world like it. When you share your life with people. When I read this statement, there's just so much about it that I love about ministry. No professional detachment. Man, we just live, we do life together. We're going to hurt together. We're going to be happy together. And we're going to do everything in between together. The Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 15, I will very gladly spend and be spent for you. I don't know if anyone is watching maybe from a different congregation, so I'll say this for maybe your preacher who can't say it for you. No matter what you may think of your preacher, I can tell you this, he wants to share his life with you. He's not looking to be judgmental of you. He's not looking to harm you. He just wants to share his life with you. He wants you to be a part of his life, and he wants to be a part of your life, and he wants to serve Jesus together with you. Do that with him. Let him do that with you. And I think you'll find a wonderful blessing in it for both of you. Then he says, this is why I wanted to share myself with you, because there's a sweetness. You were dear to us. We loved you. We loved you. So that is him going through this positive, negative back and forth. Now he's going to move to the positive. He's going to give us three things that he did amongst them positively. Number one, he's going to talk about how considerate he was of them, expounding upon some things he said earlier. He's going to talk about his conduct again. Then he's going to talk about his care for them. But first of all, he's considerate. He said, I want you to remember when I was with you. Our labor and toil. I worked night and day, most likely in the tent making profession, working with leather, Acts 18, verse 3. Being raised in Tarsus in Cilicia, would have had a large population there with goats and different things, and he would have been easy for him to learn that skill made from that dark black goat's hair that would have been used in tent making. And he received support from Philippi while he was in Thessalonica, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 16. But he says, I worked and I labored and toiled to the point of exhaustion, night and day, the Hebrew way of calculating time when you look back at Genesis chapter 1. I went without sleep. I worked secularly. I never took anything from you. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 7 and verse 8 and verse 9. I took no one's bread without paying for it. Again, he had the right to, but he didn't. And he says, this is why I was striving not to be a burden to you. I didn't want you to have to worry about paying me while I proclaim to you the gospel of God. So what is he doing there? He's being considerate of them. Number two, he says, and your witnesses and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. Holy has reference with our conduct toward God. We behaved in a way that was consistent with what God said. We were righteous, which many times has reference to our relationship with other people. You saw the way I treated other people, and I treated people the right way. I treated people with respect and dignity. And he goes on to say, I was blameless. Sure, anybody can throw an accusation. But he says, you know I didn't do anything wrong. No credible charge. And sometimes that's the peace that you have. And sometimes you don't have to open your mouth and defend everything you say because your ministry, your life, speaks for itself. That charge just isn't true, and everybody knows it's not true. That's what he's saying. I conducted myself this way amongst you. He said, I cared for you like a father cares for his children. He said, I did three things for you. I exhorted you. I encouraged you and pushed you in the right directions. Then I encouraged you. I comforted you in the ups and downs. And as you're, listen, when you get into Christianity, and you're always going to have up and down moments. When you get into Christianity, it's like a whole new world, a whole new system. And sometimes you can get overwhelmed with the mistakes you make, and you need someone there with you to walk with you and say, hey, it's okay. Get up. It's going to get better. We're going to work at this. You need somebody to walk with you, to encourage you and comfort you. And then he says, I charged you. I provided guidance. This is how we handle this. This is how we do this. This is the kind of character that we have to develop. And so he says, I did that for each one of you. And he said, because this is what I was wanting to develop in you, that you would walk in a manner worthy of God. Wow. Think about that statement. Walk in a manner worthy of God from a sinful human being who is anything but worthy. He said, I want you to walk in a manner that's worthy of your God. The only commentary that I can give to that is maybe 1 Peter 1, 15 and 16, to be holy because he's holy. And he said he calls us into his own kingdom, to his church, his rule, his reign, and to his glory. And so he said, that's what I wanted for you. And so when he said, I'm here to do ministry, he said, I was pure in everything I did. I was pure in all of my motives that produced my actions. It was about purity. I wasn't here for myself. I didn't take anything from you. The only thing I wanted was to glorify God and to do you good. That's it. And in it, you see a wonderful heart and model for ministry, because at the end of the day, we're all in ministry if we're children of God. And so we can learn a lot from the purity of the apostle and his companions as they labored amongst the Thessalonians. We hope it's been helpful to you today. Hope that you'll stick around and for our sermon study here in just a few more, well, not a few more minutes. It'll be a few more minutes from the time I'm recording this, but you can just click over if you desire. But hope you'll stick around for that particular time, and maybe it can help you in your worship today. Thanks for being with us.